She was just a maid, scrubbing floors in a billionaire's mansion, until the unthinkable happened. The world's richest man collapsed, gasping for life. His doctors were helpless, but she saw something they missed, a hidden clue buried in his symptoms. She spoke, and they laughed, until he got worse, much worse. In a shocking twist, she made a desperate move and saved him. Now the world is after her. Was it luck, a secret past, or something far more dangerous? Elena had once dreamed of saving lives in a hospital, wearing a doctor's coat, hearing people call her Dr. Ruiz. Instead, she scrubbed floors in a billionaire's mansion, called just the Maid by people who would never know her name. She kept her head down, ignored the sting in her chest, and pushed through the night. But nothing, not her past, not her shattered dreams, could prepare her for what was about to happen. Tonight, the Pembroke estate was buzzing with the arrival of Donovan Hayes, the billionaire, the man whose name made the stock market tremble. Ruthless, unforgiving, more powerful than some governments. Elena barely looked up when he arrived, until she heard the glass hit the floor. She turned just in time to see him sway. His jaw clenched, his fingers trembled. A man like him should never look weak, but he was. Something was wrong. A second later, he collapsed. Chaos exploded in the room. A woman screamed. Silverware clattered. The host, Mr. Pembroke, leaped from his seat. "Call an ambulance!" Elena did not move. She sprinted. Before anyone else could react, she was on her knees beside him, pressing two fingers to his neck. His pulse was fading. His breathing was shallow. This was not a random collapse. This was cardiac arrest. If they waited, he would die. Her voice sliced through the noise. "I need aspirin. Now!" A butler hesitated. Guests stared. Who was she to give orders? "Now!" she snapped, her voice carrying an authority that silenced the entire room. The butler bolted. She tore open Hayes's collar, loosening his tie. "Mr. Hayes, can you hear me?" His eyes barely fluttered. His body was shutting down. The butler returned, panting, handing her the aspirin. She crushed it between her fingers and slipped the powder under his tongue. "Come on," she whispered. "Stay with me." Nothing. His body gave a violent shudder, then another. "Breathe," she commanded. A beat passed. Then air rushed into his lungs. His chest rose, fell, and then his eyes flickered open. Just barely, but enough. Enough to see her. To really see her. The paramedics crashed through the doors. One knelt beside her. "What did you do?" She rattled off her steps. The paramedic's expression shifted from confusion to awe. "You just saved Donovan Hayes' life." Silence. The guests stared at her as if she had just performed magic. Mrs. Pembroke's face twisted. She looked at Elena the way a queen might look at a servant who had dared to speak out of turn. Elena did not care, because as Hayes was wheeled out, barely conscious, his gaze locked onto hers. There was something in his eyes, something powerful. And in that moment, Elena knew. Her life had just changed forever. Elena woke up the next morning expecting everything to be the same. The same old uniform, the same silent halls, the same feeling that no one in this house would ever look at her twice. But the moment she stepped into the kitchen, she knew something had changed. The staff was whispering, staring. Even Mrs. Pembroke's personal assistant, who never so much as glanced at the maids, was wide-eyed as she spoke into her earpiece. Then the head butler stormed in. "Elena, Mr. Pembroke wants to see you. Now." Her stomach dropped. Was she in trouble? She had saved a life. That should have meant something. But in houses like these, power mattered more than right and wrong. She followed the butler through the grand hall, her heartbeat hammering. The door to Mr. Pembroke's study was open. She stepped inside. Mr. Pembroke sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his fingers steepled. And across from him, staring directly at her, was Donovan Hayes. Only now he looked very different. No longer pale, no longer on the brink of death. He was controlled, measured. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers like a predator assessing prey. "Elena Ruiz," he said, his voice smooth but unreadable. "Take a seat." She hesitated. She was just a maid. She was not supposed to sit. Mr. Pembroke cleared his throat. Mr. Hayes asked for you personally? She sat. Hayes leaned forward. You saved my life last night. She nodded, his gaze sharpened. How did you know what to do? I, I studied medicine, she admitted, before I had to drop out. A flicker of something crossed his face. Interest? Calculation? It was gone too fast to tell. Mr. Pembroke folded his hands. Elena, I do not know what you were thinking, interfering last night, but you should have waited for the paramedics. Her stomach clenched. Here it was. The punishment. But, Hayes cut in, his voice firm, if she had waited, I would be dead. Silence. Mr. Pembroke looked uncomfortable. Hayes was not a man anyone argued with. Hayes turned back to Elena. You have medical training. How much? She swallowed. 2 years of med school. I had to leave because I could not afford the tuition. His jaw tightened slightly. Then to her shock, he said, You should not be scrubbing floors. Mr. Pembroke tensed. Mr. Hayes. Hayes ignored him. I have an offer. Elena could barely breathe. You are wasted here, Hayes continued. I want you working for me. Her heart nearly stopped. Mr. Pembroke's face darkened. She is under contract. I will buy out her contract, Hayes said dismissively, and triple her salary. Elena's mind spun. Triple? That was more money than she had ever dreamed of. But why? She asked, unable to stop herself. Hayes smiled. Because I do not believe in accidents, Miss Ruiz. You saved my life for a reason. Now let us see what you can really do. Elena could not process what had just happened. One moment, she was a maid, a nobody. The next, Donovan Hayes had rewritten her future with a single sentence. She walked out of Mr. Pembroke's mansion in a daze. A black car was already waiting. A driver in a sleek suit opened the door for her. This way, Miss Ruiz. Miss Ruiz, not maid, not girl. She slid into the plush leather seat, her pulse racing. As the car pulled away, she realized she had not even packed her things. But did she need to? Everything from her old life felt distant, irrelevant. She turned to the driver. Where are we going? Mr. Hayes's estate. Of course. Someone like him would have an estate, not just a house. The drive felt surreal. Just yesterday, she had been scrubbing dishes, invisible to the world. Now she was heading into the unknown, under the command of a billionaire who had taken a sudden, almost unnerving interest in her. The gates of the Hayes estate loomed ahead, massive and intimidating. The car rolled through, past manicured lawns and marble fountains. When she stepped out, a woman in a crisp navy suit greeted her. Miss Ruiz, welcome. I am Olivia Carter, Mr. Hayes' chief of staff. Follow me. Elena did. The house was a masterpiece of glass and steel, sleek and modern. Nothing about it felt warm. They entered a spacious office where Donovan Hayes was waiting. He gestured to the seat across from him. Sit. She obeyed, heart pounding. Hayes studied her, tapping his fingers against the desk. You said you completed 2 years of medical school? She nodded. Then you have enough knowledge to be useful. Useful. The word sent a chill through her. I have a personal medical team, Hayes continued, but I do not trust them. You, however, had nothing to gain when you saved me. That makes you rare and valuable. Elena clenched her fists under the table. Was this about trust or something more? What exactly do you want me to do? She asked. A small smile played on his lips. I have a condition, one that has stumped some of the best doctors in the world. I want you to help me find a solution. Her breath hitched. Her? I am not a doctor, she reminded him. Not yet. His gaze was steady. But you are smarter than most doctors I have met. I do not believe in talent being wasted. I will fund your education, provide access to the best resources, and ensure you finish what you started. She blinked. You would pay for me to finish medical school? Yes. He leaned forward. But in return, you work for me. Exclusively. Your mind, your skills, they belong to me. Her pulse pounded. This was not just a job offer. It was an opportunity, one that came with a price. She could say no, walk away, return to a life of scrubbing floors. Or she could step into a world where power ruled. and where one wrong move could cost her everything. Elena's mind spun. This was not just a job, it was a contract with the devil. But she had spent too many nights lying awake, haunted by the unfinished dream of becoming a doctor. If she said no, she knew she would regret it for the rest of her life. She took a deep breath. I accept. Donovan Hayes smiled, but there was something unreadable in his gaze. Good. From that moment on, her life transformed at a speed she could barely process. She was immediately enrolled in a top-tier medical program, but unlike other students, she had access to world-class mentors, private labs, and cutting-edge research. It was an accelerated path, one designed not just to make her a doctor, but a pioneer in medical science. For months, she immersed herself in her studies, pushing her limits, absorbing knowledge like a sponge. But every time she stepped into the sleek glass mansion, she was reminded, this was no ordinary arrangement. Donovan was watching her progress closely. His illness remained a mystery. The world did not know he was sick. There were no public records, no medical files. And yet, he was deteriorating. His symptoms were erratic. One day he seemed perfectly fine. The next he would collapse without warning. The doctors he had hired could not diagnose it. But Elena was different. She spent every free moment researching, piecing together symptoms, consulting hidden case studies. And then, one night, it hit her. She found the answer. It was a neurological condition, so rare that only 6 cases had ever been documented. The treatment did not exist yet, but she could create it. She worked tirelessly, pushing past exhaustion, past doubt. She experimented, refined, and tested. And finally, after months of relentless effort, she stood before Donovan with the cure. This will work, she told him, her voice steady. He looked at her. This maid-turned-medical genius. This woman who had started as nothing. And for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that was never there before. Respect. The treatment was administered. The results were immediate. Donovan's strength returned. His symptoms vanished. He was cured. Words spread like wildfire. The business world was shaken. The billionaire who was rumored to be dying was back. And behind his recovery, not a world-renowned doctor, not a prestigious hospital, a Maid. Offers flooded in. Governments, research institutions, and pharmaceutical companies wanted her. But Elena was no longer just a woman who took orders. She was now a powerful force. And for the first time, she was the one calling the shots. As she stood at the top of the world, one thing was clear. She was never meant to scrub floors. She was meant to change the world.